2022 STIR seminar series, and I'm pleased to acknowledge our partners at East and Maastricht. And I will agree to be live streamed. The mission of the seminar is to provide an opportunity for people to learn, converse, build skills, debate, understand the nuances of the STIR method and its both limitations and capacities, and to grow the STIR community worldwide. So what is STIR? Most of you know this, but for those who need a refresher, it is a method, a research method that sits somewhere in between more of an observer approach and more of an action research approach. It's neither observation strictly, nor is it action research in the sense that it tries to bring about a change for its own sake, but it does bring about changes. However, we use these changes in order to understand expert capacities, to reason differently, to behave differently, to experience their role as agents within highly structured environments differently, okay? And thus to respond to broader societal considerations and concerns. And we do this in a way that also allows us to understand how these capacities can be robustly exercised or more robustly exercised. And this sort of gets into the realm of policy and institutional design. And then finally, there is an emphasis in STIR on actually not just studying these capacities and probing them, but also enhancing them. But we say that this is something that must be done in an appropriate manner because we want to make it, to make sure it doesn't disrupt our attempts to understand those capacities. So the STIR methodology is fairly in-depth, and it has a number of components. The three main ones are a decision protocol, which we use to structure our dialogues, a certain ethos of engagement, which is usually associated with the embedded humanist, and finally, a framework for analyzing the results from the dialogues, which is called midstream modulation. And STIR has been very active. I think we've had over 70 known studies, and these studies are normally 12-week studies, and they've been all around the world on about 4 different continents, and there's a number of publications and approaches and interpretations and applications, and we're very pleased to bring together 12 of them in this year for this series. And each seminar, as you know, has one paper attached to it, and we have distributed that in advance. So today, I'm very pleased to introduce Mareika Smolka. Mareika is our speaker today. She will be speaking about affect and careful engagement in STIR. Mareika is a PhD candidate at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. She's also a Fulbright scholar here at Arizona State University. And in the fall, she will be a postdoc researcher at Aachen University. Mareika has received a number of awards, which is very impressive for a junior scholar, including the prestigious Varela Award from the Mind and Life Europe Institute. And she has a number of publications, again, very impressive for a junior scholar, including in outlets such as Science, Technology, and Human Values, Nanoethics, Sciences, Culture, and Biosocieties. So I'm very, very pleased to introduce Mareika, and we will yield the floor to her, and I will stop sharing my screen so she can share hers.
Great, so I'm very pleased to see so many familiar faces here today. And yeah, I'll just see if I can share my screen too. So yes, you should be able to see it. And yeah, as Eric already kindly introduced me, I will immediately go into the topic of today. I will present results from my PhD research, which were informed by a collaboration with Eric and with Alexandra Haustein from the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology. All of us have been involved in interdisciplinary collaborations with natural scientists and engineering researchers to understand and enhance their capacities for integrating societal considerations and ethical reflection in technoscientific decision-making. Eric, Alexandra, and I conducted steer studies in different laboratories and fields of research. This went too fast, but what I wanted to say is that over the course of our collaborative research project, we realized that interdisciplinary collaboration and ethical reflection involve as much cognitive labor, as you see here in the head on the left side of the screen, as bodily affective labor. So we realized that the body actually plays an important role in our interdisciplinary collaborations. And this became evident when we all took field notes on the affective dimension of our 12-week laboratory engagement projects that we later recognized as a form of disconcertment. In spite of much efforts to discipline bodily affects, especially in academic contexts where cognitive labor is highly esteemed, we noticed that attending to disconcertment can facilitate collaboration across disciplinary divides and contribute to both knowledge production and technoscientific practices. We substantiate this claim in our co-authored article From Affect to Action, which develops a heuristic of disconcertment to analyze empirical material from the 3 steer studies that you see on the slide. In this presentation, I will not summarize the empirical findings presented in the article. Instead, I will use the heuristic of disconcertment to analyze the different formats in which I deployed steer in my PhD research. So for this purpose, I will first introduce our conceptualization of disconcertment, the research questions, and the heuristic of disconcertment that I developed with Eric and Alexandra. I will then introduce you to my steer research in the Silvasanti study and analyze different modes of careful engagement, which allowed me to transform disconcertment into a productive resource for socio-technical integration. After a discussion of the findings and some conclusive remarks, there will be time for questions. And in the last 10 minutes of the seminar, I will give you some idea of more recent work that I've been conducting with steer and also what future steer-related research will be about. So the common understanding of disconcertment is an affective state of being made self-consciously uncomfortable. Empirical philosopher Hélène Véran was alert to her fleeting experience of disconcertment while doing fieldwork in a Nigerian primary school, where she studied the encounter of Nigerian and Western math. She introduces disconcertment as a methodological resource for seeing certainty disrupted and for unsettling for what has so far been taken for granted. She and other scholars borrowing from her work describe moments of disconcertment as indicators of metaphysical, epistemological, normative, or methodological differences. The anthropologist Hillesdal and her colleagues draw on Véran's notion of disconcertment in their collaboration on muscle pain with clinical researchers. Paying attention to disconcertment facilitated interdisciplinary knowledge production inherent in the concrete processes of doing connections between disciplines, people, and problems. The interdisciplinary team established connections between an anthropological relational understanding of pain and pain as a result of biological processes in the biomedical sciences, which gave rise to new questions about how to study and treat pain. Their research thrived on disciplinary differences, which they recognized and made productive through moments of disconcertment. Inspired by Véran, Hillesdal, and her colleagues, the following research questions aim to capture how experiences of disconcertment can characterize the relation between integrative researchers and their collaborators. How is disconcertment experienced in steer? Which choices do integrative researchers make in attending to disconcertment? How do disconcerting affects relate to changes in thought and action of integrative researchers and their technoscientific collaborators? To answer these questions, a heuristic of disconcertment was developed through iterative movements between social science literature on the role of the body in interdisciplinary collaboration, in Eric's, Alexandra's, and my observations of affects in steer. The heuristic helps analyze how bodies serve as sensor sources and processes to detect, probe, and process differences, so as to facilitate interdisciplinary collaboration and socio-technical integration. While the heuristic is applicable to and descriptive of each of our steer studies, it does not prescribe what choices embedded scholars or other integrative researchers should make. Rather, it serves to analytically discern different ways of dealing with disconcertment. To illustrate how disconcerted bodies can serve as sensor sources and processes and facilitate socio-technical integration, I present vignettes from STEER research and the Silva-Santi study. The Silva-Santi study, also known as Embedded Aging among researchers, is a European Horizon 2020 project that combines two study protocols, SCD-Well and Age-Well. I was mainly interested in Age-Well, a 3-armed randomized controlled clinical trial, in short RCT, with 137 study participants conducted in the city of Caen in France by Dr. Gaël Chetelat's INSERM research team. It compares the effects of an 18-month meditation intervention with a foreign language training intervention and a passive control group on mental health and well-being in older adults. Moreover, the trial includes a group of 30 long-term meditators who have logged at least 10,000 hours of meditation in Vipassana, Zen, or Tibetan Buddhist traditions. These so-called expert meditators undergo the same battery of study examinations as the older adults. Comparing novice with expert meditators helps to understand the mechanisms underlying meditation that are assessed with cognitive, behavioral, biological, neuroimaging, and sleep examinations. Although the Silva-Santi study was funded by the European Commission's Horizon 2020 framework program, in which responsible research and innovation was identified as a cross-cutting issue, there was no ethics or society work package included in the study's consortium. I quickly learned that within the research team, ethics was conceived of as ethics management, making sure that all research would comply with relevant legal and ethical norms. Hence, the STEER interventions, which I launched independently in the Silva-Santi team, did not conflict with any responsible research and innovation activities that could have been embedded in the study. My STEER research in the Silva-Santi study was motivated by recent academic and public discussions on scientists' responsibility for the social and ethical impacts of mindfulness research. These discussions revolve less around so-called hard impacts, that is, whether mindfulness research is safe and avoids clear instances of harm, but rather focuses on soft impacts. Soft impacts of mindfulness research refer to the ways in which it can influence cultural norms, conceptions of personhood, and societal injustices. While opponents are worried that mindfulness research banalizes the Buddhist path to awakening to brain training, proponents consider scientific evidence for the health benefits and pro-social qualities of mindfulness as an important contributor to a wide-scale transformation towards a more healthy and peaceful society. To study mindfulness researchers' capacities to engage with these wider contextual dimensions of their work, I deployed STEER in the Silva-Santi research team. STEER interventions included a laboratory engagement study, a STEER group discussion, and a reflexive seminar. The laboratory engagement study followed Fisher's original 12-week study design. From September to December 2018, I was an embedded humanist in the Silva-Santi study, where I conducted ethnographic fieldwork and had regular STEER dialogues with 4 research team members following the STEER decision protocol. I did not only conduct pre- and post-interviews, but also visited the Silva-Santi study for another period of fieldwork from October to December 2019 to capture the effects of the laboratory engagement study. In addition, the Silva-Santi team was invited to participate in 2 2-hour STEER focus groups. During the first focus group in December 2018, I facilitated a group discussion on an ethical challenge that all research team members identified as relevant to their work practices. Following Fisher's methodological suggestions for deploying STEER in focus groups, the STEER decision protocol was used to map different viewpoints, concerns, and suggestions for taking action in a collaborative process. In December 2019, I organized a second focus group that was inspired by Fisher and Mahajan's discussion of social science scholarship in interdisciplinary seminar groups to build capacities for socio-technical integration among collaborators. In a similar vein, I presented social science scholarship on mindfulness meditation research to stimulate reflections on the broader socio-ethical considerations and contexts of the kind of research conducted in the Silva-Santi study. After both focus groups, I asked participants to complete a questionnaire to capture immediate effects. The focus groups, as well as the regular STEER dialogues, were recorded and transcribed. In addition, I took field notes on the effective dimensions of these interventions and of the evolving relationship between me and my collaborators. To analyze the role of affect in collaborative socio-technical integration, I applied the midstream modulation framework to the empirical material and used the heuristic of disconcertment to examine the ways in which affects shape modulation sequences. As most of you are familiar with the midstream modulation framework, especially because we discussed it in previous seminars of our series, I will not introduce it here. The perspectives opened up by the heuristic of disconcertment will hopefully become more comprehensible when applying the heuristic to vignettes from my STEER intervention. The first vignette stems from regular STEER dialogues with PhD researchers and focuses on a measurement task that relates to one of the Silva-Sante study's focal points, investigating the effects of meditation training on emotions. To study how meditation in comparison to learning English influences emotional responses to the suffering of others, participants in the 3-armed HWell RCT undergo a brain imaging task that involves silent video clips with either scenes of low emotional content, showing everyday activities, or with high emotional content of suffering. Assisting the video task for the first time, I experienced a moment of disconcertment captured in this vignette. I joined a PhD student and a radiologist who administered the task in a room next door to the brain scanner in which the participant was lying. 3 computer screens were blinking. 2 showed a range of images of the participant's brain, and the other allowed us to follow the videos that were projected to the participant. After the PhD student had launched the task, I watched the videos attentively and realized that the furrow on my forehead was becoming steeper the longer I kept on watching. The videos with high emotional content portrayed people with disabilities, dark-skinned toddlers who were malnourished, women with headscarves crying in the ruins of a city, and similar scenes filmed in African and in Arab countries. I gained the impression that suffering was equated with the experience of disability in life in the global south. As this portrayal of suffering made me feel unsettled, I bluntly pronounced my observation. The PhD student explained that these videos were selected from news and documentary material broadcasted during peak viewing hours. Moreover, the video task had been approved by an ethics committee and it had been used in several other studies. Finally, and more importantly, the majority of participants did not make any special remarks about the task. The scene repeated itself several times whenever I assisted the video task over the course of the STEER study. In the pre-interviews, PhD students had also stressed that the most important ethical aspect of their work was taking care of participants, making sure that they felt accompanied and at ease. As scientists often have multiple demands placed upon them, they commonly ensure that the norms and standards of their laboratory are followed, including care for participants, before reflecting upon every possible aspect of their work. Acting in accordance with their professional responsibilities towards study participants, the ethical aspects that the PhD student prioritized differed from what unsettled me. As I carefully confronted my collaborators with my unsettlement about the video task, my disconcerted body served as a sensor to detect a normative difference between collaborators with diverging disciplinary backgrounds and responsibilities, so me included among the collaborators. Sensing difference induced me to continue inquiring into the video task by bringing it up in STEER exercises and conversations with Silva-Sante team members. A recurring theme in these discussions was bias, which generally denotes its disproportionate weight in favor or against one thing, person, or group compared with another. It is a major concern for researchers because it impedes them from measuring what they intend to measure. When I raised the narrow representation of suffering as disability in life in the global south in conversations with scientists from the Silva-Sante team, they acknowledged it could be a form of bias. This episode, beginning with a confrontation and leading to an ongoing discussion of biases, resulted in a midstream modulation sequence. While the disconcerting experience of difference made me recognize a de facto modulation, a narrow conception of ethics that only relates to the treatment of study participants. Confronting my collaborators carefully sparked a reflexive modulation. In the post-interviews, PhD students mentioned that ethics are also in the data and relate to recognizing potential biases. The reflexive modulation ultimately gave rise to a deliberate modulation, taking potential biases into account in data analysis. The second vignette illustrates how I engaged in careful subordination in a STEER group discussion to use my body as a source to minimize difference and move with my collaborators' concerns rather than my own. In a 2-hour focus group session, I briefly explained the STEER protocol to the Silva-Sante research team and offered them 5 questions, which over the course of our ongoing collaboration had stood out to me as opportunities for decision-making that seemed to be relevant to most team members. After ending my presentation with a list of opportunities for decision-making, I anticipated that the research team would immediately engage in an animated discussion. Comments and suggestions, however, were rather timid and intermitted by awkward moments of silence. Although the group agreed to discuss the question whether and how to disclose clinically relevant incidental findings to Silva-Santi participants, for instance, the detection of a brain tumor in a research scan, I experienced a twinge of disconcertment after a researcher had remarked that the question was already answered. The researcher explained that the study protocol, informed by international guidelines for good clinical practice, defined exactly how to proceed if study examinations produced individual abnormal results indicative of health hazards. I resisted the impulse to justify my selection of questions for discussion and took a step back. I was carefully listening and feeling into this discussion as it was unfolding in order to identify moments in which my interventions would help follow the STEER decision protocol or would subtly push the group to think about concrete cases in which they struggled with communicating individual results to participants. Most of the time, however, I focused on writing down what the researchers said, making sure that I would closely stick to the terminology and modes of expression that they had. Despite my efforts to integrate in the research group over the last month, I realized that researchers were still perceiving me as a foreign social science student and that they received my actions with certain thoughts and emotions that were unintended by me. This partly unsettled me, and following my disconcertment, I tried to demonstrate that I grasped their considerations by meticulously taking notes of the discussion on the whiteboard. The vignette illustrates how I carefully subordinated myself to my collaborators by avoiding appeals to my own expertise and commitments, using only terms, values, mandates, and concepts that they recognized. I tried to alter my ingrained social science habitus, using my body as a source to move with my collaborators and their concerns. In mapping their decision-making processes with the STEER method, the Silva-Santi team members revealed situational interpretations of the study protocol and their context-specific judgments about which course of action would be ethical in a given situation. This gave rise to a modulation sequence. Researchers moved from a de facto understanding of ethics as rule following to a heightened awareness that efforts to follow general rules and procedures involved case-by-case decision-making. They identified diverse practices to advise participants and their general practitioners of elevated cholesterol levels, high average numbers of sleep apneas, or unusual results of neuropsychological tests. Ultimately, case-by-case decision-making became a deliberate element of applying general rules locally. The third STEER intervention resulted from my collaborators' request whether I could give a presentation on the socio-ethical contexts of meditation research. I took their request as a chance to find out whether a reflexive seminar session would promote socio-technical integration. Therefore, I decided to organize a focus group with ample room for discussion on the relevance of social science and humanities critiques for Silva-Santi research practices. During the focus group, a moment of disconcertment occurred that turned out to impact the writing of my dissertation and the scientists' engagement with their principal object of research. Following up on the religious studies critique about the decontextualization of meditation and scientific experiments, a PhD researcher asked the group whether meditation was separated from religion in the Silva-Santi study. Suddenly, the room fell silent, except for someone who cleared her throat self-consciously. I resisted the urge to break the unpleasant silence and instead attended to the sensations in my body. I felt how the ambience had shifted. Disconcertment filled the room and seemed to affect all of us viscerally. Then one of the senior scientists said hesitantly that the European Commission did not fund research on religion. The Silva-Santi study conducted clinical trial research on a secular meditation program. The PhD researcher, however, tentatively took issue with this account by remarking that some of the expert meditators who had participated in the study, including the renowned monk Matthieu Ricard, identified as Buddhist. As the senior researcher kept on insisting that the meditation intervention was not religious, the topic was dropped swiftly. It was only half a year later, after my body had processed the event, that I changed my interpretation of it. I had initially taken the moment of disconcertment as evidence that the religious dimension of meditation played a role, albeit subordinate, in the Silva-Santi study. I considered religion as what Lee and colleagues call a rare bird, that is, a shy species, very hard to spot while observing its environment. By staging a critical intervention, I thought I'd managed to lure the rare bird out of its nest. Yet over time, I let myself be moved more by my empirical observations than by my analytical presumptions. I kept myself from exaggerating the significance of this event and dropped the idea to write an analysis of the intersection between religion and science. Such an analysis would perform the Silva-Santi study in a way that would not be in line with the world enacted by my collaborators. By using my body as a processor, I reinterpreted the interactions between me and my collaborators with careful scrutiny, which gave rise to a modulation sequence. The de facto understanding of meditation as a singular brain training in the Silva-Santi team was challenged by a reflexive modulation that meditation is more than one during the seminar session. It was not only a brain training, but also a religious practice, at least for some study participants. Instead of taking this moment as a reason for writing an analysis of boundary work between religion and science in the Silva-Santi study, processing the event led to a deliberate modulation in my dissertation writing. I presented meditation as more than one, but less than many. In this way, I acknowledged that research practices in the Silva-Santi study related to grant proposal writing, protocol adherence, the study intervention, study examinations, and researchers' shop talk, enacted meditation as a brain training, although the singular conception of meditation could be temporarily destabilized through collaborative socio-technical integration. Through the STEER intervention, me and my collaborators became aware that objects come into being in different ways through socially embedded, situated activities, and that the social is thus integral to my collaborators and my own epistemic practices. The excerpts from the STEER interventions in the Silva-Santi study emphasized that disconcertment played a central role in attempts at collaborative socio-technical integration. Although the comparative account of my analysis emphasizes similarity in both the nature and origin of disconcerting experiences, the choices made in attending to the experiences vary considerably across the three excerpts. While careful confrontation allowed me to use my body as a sensor to detect different conceptions of ethics in the laboratory engagement study, I chose to carefully subordinate myself in the STEER group discussion. My body as a source probed difference by reconsidering my habitus in relation to that of my collaborators and prioritizing their concerns over mine. Finally, in reinterpreting my empirical observations of the reflexive seminar session with careful scrutiny, my body processed difference, which allowed me to write an analysis that did justice to my collaborators' world-making practices. One may question, however, on which grounds I made these decisions. That is, why I felt entitled to confront my collaborators with my disconcertment regarding the video task, but silenced the impulse to do so in response to a scientist's assertion that ethics was rule following. My experience of disconcertment was in both cases fueled by the affective charge and bodily experience of ethics. I sensed a difference between my ethical system of orientation and that of my collaborators. Confronting technoscientific collaborators with such differences can easily result in midstream manipulation instead of midstream modulation. If an embedded humanist makes her normative commitments explicit, she runs the risk of imposing her position on her collaborators. By contrast, if she subordinates herself to her collaborators, holding back her own thoughts and STEER exercises, she might engage in a service mode of collaboration that leaves dominant problem definitions or value frameworks intact. To avoid the pitfalls of manipulation and service, Jessica Messman, a researcher experienced in video reflexive ethnography, and I proposed that interdisciplinary engagement should be careful in nature. Careful engagement implies attending as best as one can and being as discerning as possible in making choices about how to behave in a given situation. Careful engagement cannot be formalized, but is rooted in the capacity to sense the nuanced equivocations of feelings, both in oneself and in others, and to keep collaborating with and through them. In conclusion, my analysis of affect and careful engagement in STEER shows how experiences of disconcertment directly informed my methodological choices, shaped research practices, and collaborative outcomes. Describing and analyzing my intimate experiences of disconcertment helps illuminate the role of affect in interdisciplinary collaboration in at least three ways. First, it shows that affects matter. Downplaying them renders us inattentive to a major part of interpersonal contact that characterizes interdisciplinary collaborations. Second, the heuristic of disconcertment helps analyze the role of the body in collaborative interdisciplinary choices, interactions, and ways of handling difference through careful engagement. Third, the analysis highlights that disconcertment and careful engagement emerge as important yet understudied aspects of interdisciplinarity that may prove informative in understanding stories of successes and failures in attempts at collaborative socio-technical integration. These attempts are often curtailed by power dynamics in interdisciplinary spaces, which tend to position integrative researchers as co-opted service providers or critical manipulators following their own agendas. Through careful engagement, feelings of insecurity and disconcertment that may arise from an integrative researcher's liminal position can help detect and process moments in which objects become destabilized in the encounter of different disciplinary cultures. Instead of allowing these moments to go unnoticed, they can be viewed as collaborative resources for opening new conversations that are sensitive to different systems of orientation and wider social values. So yeah, thanks for your attention. And yeah, I'm curious to discuss with you and hear some questions and comments.